Welcome friends to this third lecture of module 10 or week 10 of this NPTEL online certification course of environmental soil chemistry, and in this module our topic is retention of pollutants on and within the soil solid phase. So, in our previous two lectures we have covered these aspects or these topics. First of all, we have covered the what is adsorption, and then we have also covered the adsorption of ionic pollutants. We have also covered adsorption of non-ionic pollutants. Today we are going to talk about the adsorption of complex mixture as well as the kinetics of adsorption. Then we will be talking about factors affecting adsorption if time permits. So, the next couple of lectures basically will deal with adsorption of complex mixture, then kinetics of adsorption, and then factors affecting adsorption, and then we will be talking about non-adsorptive retention, and then we will see some examples of organic and inorganic pollutant adsorption on soil solids. So, just to give a quick recap of what we have covered very briefly. So, we started with the introduction of in the introduction we talked about what are the major forces which are responsible for pollutant retention in the soils, and then we talked about the physiochemical process, adsorption on the surface, then chemical reaction with the solid phase and mechanical trapping of the pollutants in the solid phase pores. We talked about the concepts about the concepts of surface adsorption of pollutants and how this excess concentration of pollutants occur in the soil solid interface compared with that of the bulk solution on the gaseous phase, or regardless of the nature of the interface region of the interaction between the adsorbate and solid surface with which basically causes the excess. Then we talked about the surface adsorption. We covered the adsorption of ionic pollutants. In defining the ionic pollutant adsorption of ionic pollutants, we discussed the diffuse double layer, which we have already covered previously. Then based on that, we also discuss the negative adsorption and also adsorption of pathogen in the soil. Negative, adsorption of pathogen in the soil was discussed in terms of reaction between the bacterial cell wall and the and different charge, negatively and positively charged ion exchanger resins, and I have showed you two examples where these ion exchanger resins are reacting with the surface of the bacterial cell, so that the pathogens are getting attached to the soil surface. Then we discuss in details about the negative adsorption. Remember, when a charged solid surface faces an ion of like charge in an aqueous suspension, the ion is repelled from the surface by Coulombic force, and this phenomenon is known as negative adsorption. And then we have discussed why the distribution of anions based on this negative adsorption. Remember, the concentration of anion in a negative charge clay surface is very low, nearer to the clay surface. However, their concentration generally increases as the distance from the clay surface increases further. Then we discuss this negative adsorption based on this equation given by Sposito, and where this TIW basically shows the excess of excess in the moles of the ions per unit area of suspended solid. So, we related that with the mass of total water and then molality of molality of the ions, and also S, that is the specific surface area of the suspended solid. Then we also talked about the what are the factors which affects the anion negative adsorption. for example, the anion charge, concentration, pH, the presence of other anions, etc., the nature and charge on the of the surface. And so we discussed in details about the negative adsorption, and then we talked about the adsorption of the non-ionic pollutants and different mechanisms like protonations, water breathing, cation breathing, ligand exchange, hydrogen bonding, and van der Waals interactions. We talked about some examples of the non-ionic pollutants, and then we discussed their attachment or discuss their adsorption based on the thermodynamic principle, where both enthalpy and entropy based processes are equally active. Then we discussed the enthalpy related different adsorption process. While discussing the enthalpy related adsorption processes, we talked about the hydrogen bonding, and we also talked about the ligand exchange processes and protonation mechanisms. In the protonations mechanisms, we talked about the pi band. We also talked about the pi band. Remember, the pi bonds are covalent chemical bonds with two lobes of an orbital on one atom overlaps with two lobes of an orbital on another atom, and these overlaps occurs laterally. So, this pi bond we have discussed, and then we discussed the London van der Waals forces, and why these how these van der Waals forces generally occur due to the dipole or dipole induced dipole, how it occurs, and what is the range of this. Remember, this van der Waals attraction is active with a very narrow range. So, we have discussed all the properties of the van der Waals force, and then we talked about the chemisorption, and with using this picture we have discussed why chemiabsorption is very specific in nature, and then we saw the difference between the physisorption and chemiabsorption with respect to the specificity. Then we talked about the entropy related adsorptive forces, specifically hydrophobic adsorption. And while talking about the hydrophobic adsorption, we talked about the nonpolar moiety, how this nonpolar moiety adsorb to the soil organic matter, and what are the different forces which are acting for these attachment of nonpolar moiety in the soil organic matter or soil mineral surfaces, and what are the interactions between this solute and the solvent we have discussed in details. So, today we are going to start with the adsorption of complex mixture. Remember, a system characterized by the presence of multiple solution and multiple solvents. So, these are the two prerequisites for a complex mixture. Remember, there has to be either multiple solutes and multiple solvents. So, then we call it a complete complex mixture. Now, remember that since soil pollution under a waste disposal site generally occurs as a complex mixture, because there is a these areas are generally containing both inorganic and organic pollutants. So, obviously, the adsorption occurs in the complex mixture. So, in general, the adsorption mainly involves organic pollutants, and the sorption might occur from the complex solvents containing partially miscible or completely miscible organic solvents. So, this type of adsorption generally occur. Now, you might ask me, okay, how to represent this adsorption of a complex mixture. To represent mathematically this adsorption from a complex mixture, adsorption of complex mixture, we generally follow an equation given by Rao et al. In 1985. They proposed a theoretical approach based on the predominance of solvophobic or hydrophobic attractions or interactions for predicting sorption of hydrophobic organic chemicals from mixed solvents. Suppose there are mixed solvents and we want to adsorb some hydrophobic organic chemicals in the soil surface, then we have to then this reaction generally follows this theoretic equations, where this ln of Km, that is logarithm of Km, is basically Kw minus alpha I, sigma I and f I, where the sigma I basically denotes the delta gamma I HSA by KT. Now, here let us define all these terms. Here this K is basically the sorption coefficient, and the unit of the sorption coefficient is moles of solvent per kg of sorbent, and with the here we have used two superscript, one is M, another is W. So, M basically stands for the sorption from the mixed solvents, whereas W basically stands for the sorption from the water. So, obviously, as we have seen previously, in case of mixed solvents where there are many co-solvent with water, then the solubility depends on the solubility of the water plus or minus with another term. So, similarly, we are finding here in case of complex mixture, here the solubility term is related to the solubility of the water and with this term. So, in this term the sigma I is basically is a dimensionless term unique to each solvent's sorbate combination. So, it is a very specific, and this delta gamma 1 is a differential interfacial free energy, which is at the solvent sorbate interface. HSA, this term, this HSA basically is the sorbate hydrocarbonaceous surface area, and also K is the Boltzmann constant in joule per Kelvin, and T is the thermodynamic temperature in Kelvin, and Fi here, this Fi is basically the volume fraction of the ith co-solvent, and alpha I is the empirical constant. So, this is how we define these each of the term, and remember for sorption of a organic molecules or organic chemical from a complex mixture to the soil surface generally follows this mathematical equation. So, the adsorption is the process leading to a net accumulation of a compound at the interface of two contiguous phases, and we know that the adsorbent basically when we talk about the soil adsorption, here the adsorbent is the soil solid phase and the sorbate can be in a gaseous or a liquid phase as a solid. Now, when the measured adsorption data are plotted against the concentration value of the adsorbate at equilibrium, a graph is obtained which we call adsorption isotherm. Now, guys, we have already discussed these 4 adsorption isotherms in our previous lectures. So, S type, L type, H type and C type we have already discussed, and also we have discussed the mathematical description of the isotherms or models of the isotherms, for example, Freundlich isotherms and then Langmuir isotherms. So, I am not going to discuss them in details, just for a quick recap, just remember that S type isotherm where this is an S type isotherm where slope initially increases with the adsorptive concentration, but eventually decreases and becomes 0 as vacant adsorbent sites are filled. At low concentration, generally the surface has a low affinity for the adsorptive, which increases at the higher concentration. As you can see, at higher concentration the surface adsorption generally increases. However, at the lower concentration the surface has a low affinity for the adsorptive. So, we can see this is an S type isotherm. We have already discussed this, I am just giving you a quick recap. Now, L shaped or Langmuir isotherm we have discussed, it is basically decreasing the slope as concentration increases, since vacant adsorption sites decreases as the adsorbent become covered. As you can see that it is basically decreasing as the concentration is increasing. Now, explained by the high affinity of the adsorbent for the adsorptive at low concentration, which then decreases as the concentration increases. So, basically that follows the Langmuir isotherm. Then third one is the H type or high affinity isotherm. High affinity isotherm or H type isotherm basically shows the strong adsorptive interactions such as inner sphere complexes. We have already discussed what is inner sphere complex and outer sphere complex, and you can see here there is a it is very steep. The relationship is very steep. So, it shows basically the high affinity isotherm. So, here there is a strong interaction or strong affinity of the adsorptive for the adsorbate molecule. Now, the last one was the C type isotherm, it is basically shows the partitioning mechanism. Here adsorptive ions are partitioned between the interphaseal phase and the bulk solution phase without any specific bonding between the adsorbent and adsorbate, and you can see here this is the shape of this C type isotherm, adsorption isotherm. Now, if we talk about the kinetics, if we talk about the kinetics of the adsorption in the case of soil cation exchange, charge compensation cations are held in solid phases are basically in three fashion. One is within crystals in interlayer positions, for example, mica and smectite. We have already seen that this is a structure of the muscovite, which is a potassium containing mica, and you can see that in the interlayer space are occupied by these potassium ions. So, that shows that the adsorption of these soil cations are occurring in the interlayer positions. Similarly, in case of smectite, if you remember the smectite structure, it has got a huge interlayer space, and in this huge interlayer space there are several different types of species can adsorb. So, cations also can adsorb in that huge interlayer space of smectite. Now, second one is structural holes of feldspar. Now, you know that feldspars are the most abundant primary minerals, and their structure, which I will show you in the next slide, contains some holes. In these holes, these cations can reside. And third one is basically on the surface and in the cleavages and faults of the crystal on external surface of the clays and clay minerals and organic matter. Now, as you can see from this picture, this is a clay particle, and obviously these cations are present in the external surfaces of the clay particle. Now, cations held on external surfaces are, remember, they are immediately accessible for to the soil solution, as compared to those cations which are adsorbed to the internal surfaces. Cations which are adsorbed to the external surfaces are more accessible to the soil solution, and once removed from this phase. So, if we remove from this external surface area where they are adsorbed, they move to a region of smaller concentration. Obviously, there is a they tend to diffuse away from the surface of the clay particle to maintain in equilibrium. And finally, the movement is controlled by the diffusion and the diffusion coefficient through the soil, which we will discuss in our coming slides. So, what we have learned from this slide? We have learned from this slide that the cation exchange processes, in case of cation exchange process, charge compensation cations are held in the soil solid phases in three fashion. One is within the interlayer space, for example, in case of mica, in case of smectite, and second in the structural holes, for example, in case of feldspars, and thirdly on the surface and the cleavages of the crystals and on the external surface area of the clay and clay minerals, from where, and also organic matter, from where these cations basically goes to the soil solution through the process of desorption, and this movement from the external surface is controlled by different types of diffusion and diffusion coefficients. So, this is basically the feldspar structure, and you can see there are some holes where these cations can reside. So, this is also a site for cation it is a site for cationic species. Now, if we see the kinetics of adsorption, obviously we have we need to know what is the diffusion coefficient, what is the mathematical expression of the diffusion coefficient. We have just seen that the diffusion coefficient play an important role for the desorption and movement of the cations from the external surface of the clay particles and clay minerals to the bulk solution. Now, this diffusion coefficient can be which is denoted by this d, can be calculated using the equation of this Nye and Tinker, these two scientists. So, we can see that is d equal to d e, then theta f d c solution by d c sol. Now, we can see that this d e is basically the diffusion coefficient in water, okay, and theta is the water content of the soil, f is the impedance factor related to the soil tortuosity. Okay. Tortuosity means the solid pores, the soil pores are interrelated to each other, making a tortuous path or zigzag path or inconsistent path. So, that is called soil tortuosity, and C is the cation concentration of the soil and in the solution, that is mass by volume ratio. Now, here in the last term, that is DC solution to DC sol. So, basically shows the buffering capacity of the system, and it is specific constant for the soil. Obviously, when the concentration of when the concentration of a particular ion in the solution get depleted, then the adsorbed ions from the soil clay surface or other secondary mineral surface basically goes to the solution to maintain the equilibrium, and that is the representation of the buffering capacity. Now, two cation exchange properties are generally involved. First of all, the number of exchange site occupied by the cation investigated, and secondly, the selectivity of the cation relative to the concentration of the exchanging cation. Okay. So, these two are important properties which are involved in the cation exchange in the cation exchange process. So, if we see discuss the kinetics of adsorption. Now, this Weber diagram given by the scientist Weber in 1984 gives us the rate determining steps in a heterogeneous soil system. By nature, soil is heterogeneous in nature. So, you can see here, this is the picture which basically shows these are the clay particles. So, these are the clay particles, and surrounding this clay particle there is a thin film of water, and then you can see the bulk solutions. Okay. So, when the ions basically move from bulk solution to through the film to this particle site, and the actual chemical reaction exchange to occur, for actual chemical reaction to occur, the ion must be transported to the active fixed site of the particles. So, these are the active fixed active fixed sites of the particles. So, for actual chemical reactions basically exchange to occur, the ion must be moving from this bulk phase through the film to the active particle surface. Now, remember that the film of water adhering to the surrounding the particles and the hydrated interlayer space in the particle are both zones of low concentration, which are constantly being depleted by ion adsorption to the sites. So, here if these are the active sites for ion adsorption, obviously these ions are coming from these interparticle hydrated interlayer space of the particles, or from this thin from this thin film of water adhering to the particle. So, the both these areas are having the low concentration, because the concentration of the cation are basically excess in the surface. So, basically when the cations from this liquid phase goes to the specific sites, obviously these two phases are showing low concentration of the cations. So, what that means? So, basically that says the decrease in the concentration of ions in this interfacial zone is then compensated by ion diffusion from the bulk solution. So, when due to the adsorption of cation in the specific adsorption sites of the clay particle occurs, and as a result of that the interparticle interparticle liquid layer and also the film adhering to the particles are losing the cation. So, they become somewhat less in concentration for that cation. So, this decrease in concentration of the ions in these interfacial zones is then compensated by the diffusion from the bulk solution. So, here this is the bulk solution. Now, thus so ion basically will diffuse away to maintain the concentration of the film as well as the interparticle or interparticle liquid phase. So, thus in most soil and soil constituent system, either this particle diffusion. So, this is basically particle diffusion process or film diffusion. So, diffusion through the film may be the rate limiting factor. So, we are seeing that the the diffusion through this diffusion through this between the particle as well diffusion through the film are basically the rate limiting steps in the kinetics of cation or ion exchange. Now, the characteristics, if you see the characteristic period of ion exchange in soil, it very generally varies from the time varies from few seconds to days, and basically this is due to two things. One is the properties of inorganic and organic constituents of the soil solid phase and the properties of the pollutants ion change and basically properties of the pollutants ion charge and radius. So, the slowly exchangeable cations are situated on exchange sites in interlayer space of the soil mineral, that is mica, or in cages and channels of soil organic matter and exchange out into solution by diffusive flux. So, basically that says again the slowly exchangeable cations are situated on the exchange site in the interlayer space. We have already discussed that as compared to the external surface area, those cations, those are adsorbed into the external internal surface or interlayers spaces, just like in case of illite, in case of mica, in case of smectite. These are slowly exchangeable in nature. So, the slowly exchangeable cations are situated on the exchange site in the interlayer space of the soil minerals like mica or in cages or channels of the soil organic matter and exchange out into solution by diffusive flux. So, we have already discussed that. Two properties again you have to remember, one is the properties of inorganic and organic constituents of the soil solid phase and the properties of the pollutants ion charge and also their radius. So, guys, I hope that you have learned something new. We have discussed some important kinetics of adsorption and also how this ion exchange occurs in the particles, heterogeneous soil particles, and we also have mathematically defined the diffusion coefficients in this lecture. So, I hope that you have gathered some new knowledge, and let us wrap up our lecture here, and in the next lecture we will be talking about the other aspects or of kinetics of adsorption, and also we will see some examples of pollutant adsorption onto the soil solid phases. Thank you very much. Let us meet in our next lecture.